Hi, this is Dr. Michael Bardot, and I would like to welcome you to the lecture on the subject of the civilization of Persia. We've mentioned Persia a little bit in the past when we were talking about the Mesopotamian region and the last of the Mesopotamian empires known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Um, now we're going to take a very brief look at that empire which was called the Persian Empire. If we take a look at the map up here, it's not 100% large, but if we take a look at the map, what we see here is we see over on the very edge of the map, the area known as Persia. And as we can tell, Persia started out extremely small in size, but it would not remain so. Now, unfortunately, because it was located on the kind of extreme kind of edge or border of the area we call Mesopotamia, we don't know a whole lot about the origins of the Persian state or the Persian monarchy. We begin to identify or have some records about the Persians with the so-called rise or the stability of the Achaemenid dynasty. The Achaemenid dynasty is named after a legendary figure known as Achaemenes. And we don't know a whole lot about him. That's why you can see there in terms of the dates, we have some question marks about when he possibly lived or possibly died. But we can definitely say that based on evidence, archaeological evidence, and external materials, we can say that at this point in time, Persia was fairly small and primarily operated as what we call a vassal state of the Medes or the Medians. Now, we start to have some concrete information come in the form of the second dynastic ruler of the Achaemenids, and that would be Teispes. Now, Teispes, we don't know exactly when he took power, but we have a definite external record of when he died, which is he died in the 640s. Under Teispes, we begin to have the rise of Persia as Persia began to expand and began to conquer some of its neighboring peoples, including the city-state of Anshan. And at that point, as we move forward, Anshan was merged to Persia, and we have a growing kind of Persian state. It still started out or still remained relatively obscure in terms of importance and remained kind of a vassal state of both the Median and the Elamite empires. Elam is located here, which were more kind of connected to that Middle Eastern Mesopotamian cultural history. Interesting enough, it's really not going to be until later in the dynasty that Persia reached its great importance under the rulership of considered to be its greatest king, Cyrus the Great. Cyrus ruled from approximately the 550, 559 to the 530s, or specifically 530. When he became king, Cyrus had a pretty good stroke of luck because previously the Persian kings had a tendency to kind of split the kingdom up between their kids. And even though it might seem nice or seem good to give something to each one of your children, by doing that, you actually weaken the empire because you've now split it up between two different perspectives, two different ruling families. And if those families continue to have kids, you could have the continual kind of breaking up of the empire into smaller and smaller parts. However, Cyrus the Great is extremely lucky in that when he first becomes king, he inherits Persia. And then later on, he will then, when his brother dies, he will inherit Anshan as well, which basically gives him a unified kingdom. Once that happens in the 540s, he is going to then start a process by which he will lead the Persians into an expansion, conquering basically the Elamites, the Lydians, and the Medes, reaching the city of Babylon in the year 539. And it's actually kind of an interesting story, I think, to understand the greatness of Cyrus the Great. 539 was an interesting year for the Babylonian Empire. That was a year in which the king of the Babylonians was generally despised by most of the empire, and most of his reign was pretty tumultuous or pretty rocky. At one point, he left the city of Babylon to go out and try to put down a local revolution against his authority. And at that point, the people of Babylon barred the city gates and basically locked him out of his own capital city. As you might expect, that made him extremely angry, and he settled in to kind of siege the city of Babylon and conquer it and take it back. But it just so happened at that time that Cyrus the Great, who had conquered the Elamites and the Medes and the Lydians, entered into the Babylonian Empire and made a direct kind of path to the city of Babylon itself, knowing that if he could conquer Babylon, he would pretty much get the entire empire together. It was at that point that he caught the the Neo-Babylonian king outside the city walls, and in a great battle, he was able to crush the Neo-Babylonian king, basically because he was trapped between the city walls and between Cyrus the Great's army. At that point, Cyrus the Great tried to make overtures of peace to the people of Babylon to get them to welcome him in as king. They, however, refused, so Cyrus the Great had to siege the city, but he went about conquering the city of Babylon in a different way. He basically studied the city plans that he was able to kind of get a hold of and get an idea of how the city worked, and he realized that the sewer system of Babylon was based predominantly on the Tigris River. And so what he did, which is, I think, kind of interesting and ingenious, is he actually blocked the Tigris River so that the water levels would drop low enough that his army could actually invade the city under the city walls, going through the sewer system, which he did in the year 539. Now, interesting enough, even though he had by rights won the right to kind of spoil the city, he got the right to basically loot it or take control of it, Cyrus the Great actually went through a Babylonian ritual of coronation to take on a kind of air of being the one legitimate king of Babylon. He did this also by learning the Babylonian language and communicating with the Babylons in their language rather than forcing the Babylonians to deal with him in Persian. As time went on, one of the big things he did was he went ahead and dissolved all debt of the Babylonian people. He kind of gave them a fresh start, which went a long way to kind of increasing the goodwill of Cyrus. Now, the one thing he also did do, which the Babylonians probably didn't like, but couldn't really have a say in, was he also at the same time freed the slavery class of the Babylonians, which just so happened to be the ancient Hebrews. He freed them from slavery, and he gave them money to go back home to the city-state of Judah. And most importantly, he gave them enough money to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem, which was a major point of their religion. And so because of that, if you actually happen to read the Old Testament, Cyrus the Great gets a tremendous amount of good press in the Bible and is actually designated as having the title of the Hand of God, because he liberated the Hebrews and basically helped them rebuild their temple so that they could once again practice their religion. Now, unfortunately, even though Cyrus the Great was a great leader, he did not always make good decisions. One of the decisions he made was to invade a group of people known as the Massagetae. And the Massagetae, traditionally, we believe, kind of lived right in this area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And by invading them, he made a fundamental mistake, because as many later empires realized, the group of people that lived here were extremely difficult to conquer. Even though they didn't have much in terms of wealth, they were used to a very rugged and a very harsh lifestyle, which enabled them to create some of the best or the most resilient military forces in the ancient world. And unfortunately for Cyrus, what he thought would be a fairly simple campaign wound up becoming a very hard fought battle in which the Persians were defeated and Cyrus the Great himself died in that battle. Power to two brothers, Cambyses II and his brother Smerdis. But at some point in time, we believe there was a brief civil war, a brief civil dispute between the two, in which Cambyses was the victorious, and he basically executed his brother and took full control of the Persian Empire. It was under Cambyses II that Persia continued to expand its borders, conquering parts of Egypt, northern Egypt, with the help of Phanes of Halicarnassus, and trying to set up a stable kind of dominant control over northern Egypt. Now, he tried to conquer southern Egypt, but was repelled by the Kushite forces that had basically invaded Egypt from the south and kind of settled in. Now, the interesting thing about Cambyses II, however, is that it seems that as time went on, he became somewhat paranoid, also possibly delusional, and definitely suicidal, because what we see happening as he's focusing on the far western portions of the Persian Empire, Egypt and Palestine, he lost kind of control of his home territory of Persia and Babylon, as they soon soon began to support an individual who named himself Smerdis and claimed to be the dead brother, the long-lost brother of Cambyses II. We don't believe that he was, but as far as we can tell, the name recognition was enough to kind of get him much-needed kind of traction in kind of setting up a revolutionary or a rival government. In the face of this revolution, as well as an increasing dissatisfaction that the military had with Cambyses II, eventually Cambyses was forced to recognize that his power was disappearing, and at that point, rather than face the loss of support and power of his military, Cambyses II committed suicide. That leads us to a brief kind of period in which it was about a year in which there was a type of civil war. In this civil war, basically, the cousin of the ruling family, a guy by the name of Darius, he rose to power and then set about kind of pacifying that revolution under the fake Smerdis and reestablishing a strong imperial and monarchical presence in Persia. It's really under Darius I that the empire reached its largest extension. He basically conquered parts of the land east of Persia, stretching the empire all the way from the Indus River, which is the border of India, all the way to the Danube River in the north, and of course to the Ionian or the Asian Minor coast in the west. Near the end, however, or as we were approaching kind of the midway point or approaching the end of Darius's reign, what happens, of course, is in the case of such a large empire, we start to have some revolts on the fringes. And the revolt that is most important for world history happens to be a revolt in the Greek area of Asia Minor known as Ionia, or the Ionian Revolt. Starting in 499 and kind of extending down into the 490s, late 490s, the Ionian Revolt was an increasingly problem for Darius as the Greeks, the Ionians, who were they were Greek colonists living in Asia Minor, the Ionians were effectively able to wage a fairly successful kind of obstruction or kind of a disobedience of the Persian Empire's power. That went on for about 3 years until Darius thought he would be able to end the problem by demonstrating a tremendous show of force known as the destruction of the cultural and political center of Ionia, the city-state known as Miletus. However, unfortunately, Darius's calculations, his idea it backfired on him because as we have the destruction of the city of Miletus, that kind of galvanized or unified the Ionian revolt and the Ionian disobedience of the Persians. Furthermore, because Miletus was such a renowned cultural center of Greek philosophy and Greek culture, the mainland Greeks, the Greeks that lived across the Aegean Sea in what is today Greece, they decided to get involved and to support the Ionian revolt against the Persians. As time went on, as we approached the year 490, Darius felt that in order to end the Ionian revolt, which he now felt he had to do, to try to restore that impression and that appearance and reputation of the Persian Empire, he felt that he had to launch an invasion of mainland Greece, which he would do. Unfortunately for Darius, and I'll pull up the map to kind of show you here, here's Ionia right here. Unfortunately, when he marched up and invaded mainland Greece in the 490s, he ran into a much more sophisticated and superior fighting force, which ultimately resulted in the first Persian defeat since the Persian defeat of the Massagetae. It resulted in a Persian defeat at the hands of an outside enemy. And so basically what happened is Darius was eventually forced to retreat and to kind of at least put on hold his plan of invading Greece and conquering Greece. He would eventually die in 486, but that same mentality and kind of desire to conquer Greece was continued on by Darius's son, a guy by the name of Xerxes. And Xerxes would again invade Greece in the 480s. He would invade Greece and once again try to conquer the Greeks and kind of subject them to Persian rule. But just like his father Darius, we have the famous Battle of Thermopylae. The Persian army was once again defeated. And these two defeats at the hands of the Greeks pretty much sent ripples out through the remainder of the Persian Empire and led to subsequent revolts in city-states like Babylon and Syria and in other areas like that. And so as a result, after the reign of Xerxes, or near the end of the reign of Xerxes, what we see happening is a reversal of fortune. We see the Persian Empire beginning to kind of fall apart and decay and shrink, and we have the rising power of the Greeks as they will eventually begin to expand into former Persian territory, and they will start constructing what we call the Greek Empire. Xerxes died pretty much in kind of a period of defeat and disgrace. His son Artaxerxes tried to maintain a defense against the Greeks, but he himself would suffer. The Persian army would again suffer defeats at the battles of Eurymedon and Salami and Cyprus, until finally in 449, the Persians bought some time by negotiating a very lopsided, one-sided peace with the Greeks called the Peace of Callias. And then basically from 449, just to close the book on the Persians, from 449 until they would be conquered by a Greek by the name of Alexander the Great in the 320s, the Persian Empire was then, from that point forward, from 449 forward, very consistently losing pieces and cohesiveness of its empire, and again shrinking back to what was originally that original Persian state that we identified on the map earlier. So really what we have in terms of Persia is a tale of two peoples, a tale of two civilizations that clashed in the form of the so-called Greco-Persian or Persian Wars. And that clashing of those two civilizations ultimately would mean the rise of one and the decline of the other. And in this case, it was the rise of the Greeks and the decline of the Persians. And so what had once been the largest land-based empire ever to that point in history, the Persian Empire, starting from 449 forward began to kind of decay and fall apart and be replaced by a surging or a rising Greek presence and a Greek dominance in the ancient world. I hope that was informative. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. If you have more questions, obviously you can give me an email. Definitely read up on these civilizations in terms of the Lumen Learning Boundless World History Hub. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.